Hey everyone, welcome back to Case Breakdown Teen Perspective. My name is Julia and I'm an incoming junior in high school. This podcast is where I break down real criminal law cases and explain not only what happened, but why these cases changed the legal system we have today, all from the perspective of a teenager who is interested in learning more about law, specifically criminal law. Law has always been something I've been interested in, as I've said previously in my last episode, especially criminal law. Through this podcast, my goal is to explore that interest while also making law easier to understand for anyone who wants to learn more. Every 2 weeks, I'll be breaking down important criminal law cases, explaining the story behind them, the legal questions they created, the decisions made by courts, and why these cases still matter today. In the last episode, we talked about Miranda v. Arizona, the case that created the Miranda rights we hear about all the time, like you have the right to remain silent. We learned how the Supreme Court decided that people in police custody need to understand their rights before being questioned. But before police can question someone, they often need to collect evidence first. Police investigations can involve searching homes, cars, or personal belongings to find evidence connected to a crime. But this creates an important question. How much power should police have when searching someone's private property? Should police be able to enter someone's home whenever they believe evidence might be inside, or should there be rules that protect people's privacy? The question is exactly what today's case focuses on. Today we are breaking down Mapp v. Ohio. To understand this case, we first need to talk about the Fourth Amendment. Now, the Fourth Amendment protects people from unreasonable searches and seizures by the government. Basically, it means police cannot just search someone's home or take someone's belongings whenever they want. Instead, usually police need something called a search warrant. A search warrant is official permission from a judge that allows police to search a specific place for specific evidence. The reason this exists is because the government has a lot of power, and the Constitution creates limits on how that power can be used. Instead of police officers deciding completely on their own whether they can search someone's home, a judge has to look at the situation and decide if the search is actually justified. To get that warrant, police need something called a probable cause. Probable cause does not mean police have to know for sure that someone committed a crime. It means they have enough information and evidence to make a reasonable person believe that a crime may have happened or that evidence of a crime could be found in a certain place. Today, most people assume police need a warrant before searching a home, but before this case, the rules about what happened when police searched somewhere illegally were much less clear, and that is exactly why this case became so important. The story begins in Cleveland, Ohio in 1957. At this time, police were investigating a bombing that had recently happened. During their investigation, officers received information that a man connected to the bombing might be inside the home of a woman named Mapp. Now, an important detail is that Mapp was not originally the person police were investigating. They were not accusing her of causing the bombing. Instead, they believed her home might contain information or evidence connected to someone else. Because of this information, police went to Mapp's house. They knocked on the door and asked to come inside. Mapp simply said no. And this moment is actually really important legally. A lot of people assume that if police show up at your door, you automatically have to let them enter. But that is not always true. In many situations, people have the right to refuse a search if officers do not have legal permission to enter. A person's home is considered one of the most protected areas under the Constitution because it is where people have the highest expectation of privacy. So, with that being said, Mapp refused to let them inside. The officers left, but the situation did not end there. A few hours later, police came back to Mapp's home. This time, there were more officers present. They again demanded to enter. Once again, Mapp refused. The officers then claimed that they had a search warrant. Mapp asked to see it, and this small moment became one of the biggest issues in this entire case. A search warrant is not just a random piece of paper. It represents approval from a judge saying that police have a legal reason to search someone's property. By asking to see the warrant, Mapp basically was saying, Do you actually have the legal authority to be inside my home? According to court records, the officers showed her a paper they claimed was the warrant. However, Mapp argued that she was not given a real opportunity to examine it. The situation then quickly escalated. The officers entered the home. They began searching. They looked through different areas of the house, searching for evidence connected to their investigation, but they never found the person they were originally looking for. They never found evidence connecting Mapp to the bombing. Instead, during the search, officers found materials they believe violated Ohio's laws at the time. Suddenly, the focus of the investigation completely changed. This case was no longer about finding evidence connected to the bombing. Now, it was about Dolly Mapp and the items police found inside her home. And this discovery would lead to a Supreme Court case that changed the criminal justice system forever. So now that we have the main event that changed this case, the police entered Mapp's home and found materials that they believed violated Ohio law. Those materials became the main evidence used against her. At trial, prosecutors argued that because police found these items inside her house, Mapp should be convicted. But Mapp's defense focused on something completely different. Her lawyers were not mainly arguing about whether the materials themselves violated Ohio law. Instead, they asked a much bigger question. Should this evidence have been allowed in court at all? This question is where the case moves from being about one woman and one search to being about the rights of every person in the United States. To understand why this mattered, we have to talk about something called the exclusionary rule. The exclusionary rule is a legal principle that says evidence collected by the government in a violation of a person's constitutional rights cannot be used against them in a criminal trial. In simpler terms, if police break the rules while collecting evidence, that evidence may not be allowed in court. The idea behind this rule is not necessarily to punish police officers. Instead, it is meant to protect constitutional rights and encourage law enforcement to follow proper procedures. Think about it like this. Imagine a sports game where the rules say a team cannot use a certain strategy. If the team breaks that rule but still gets rewarded with a win, there is not much motivation for them to follow the rules in the future. The same idea applies to law enforcement. If police could illegally search someone's home but still use everything they found in court, there would be a less reason for them to respect the Fourth Amendment. Before Mapp v. Ohio, however, the exclusionary rule was not applied the same way everywhere. This is where things get a little bit complicated because in federal cases, meaning cases involving the federal government, the Supreme Court had already recognized that illegally obtained evidence could not be used. But states were different. Many states did not have to follow the same rule. This meant that depending on where someone lived, evidence collected through an illegal search might either be thrown out or still be used against them. And this creates a major constitutional question. Should people's Fourth Amendment right depend on what state they happen to live in? Mapp's attorneys argued no. They believed that constitutional protections should apply equally across the entire country. The case eventually reaches the Supreme Court of the United States. Now, when the Supreme Court hears a case, the justices are not only thinking about the person directly involved, but they are also thinking about how their decision will affect millions of people in the future. So the justices were not asking, was Dolly Mapp treated unfairly? They were asking, what rules should apply to the police searches across America? The justices looked at the purpose of the Fourth Amendment. The Fourth Amendment was created because the writers of the Constitution were deeply concerned about government power. Before the United States became its own country, British authorities had sometimes used broad search powers that allowed them to enter homes and search property with little restriction. The founders wanted to prevent a government from having unlimited power over private citizens. That is why the Fourth Amendment was originally created. It was designed to protect the idea that people should feel secure in their homes and belongings. The Supreme Court also considered the importance of making sure constitutional rights actually had consequences. The justices reasoned that if illegally obtained evidence could still be used in court, then the Fourth Amendment would become much weaker. A person could technically have a right against unreasonable searches, but if the government could ignore that right and still benefit from the evidence they collected, then the protection would not be very meaningful. The court was essentially asking, what is the point of having a constitutional right if there is no way to enforce it? This became the main argument behind Mapp's case. Her lawyers argued that the Fourth Amendment needed a stronger enforcement system. Without one, police departments would have little motivation to follow the rules. The state of Ohio actually disagreed. Ohio argued that excluding evidence could allow guilty people to avoid punishment because important evidence might be removed from trial. They argued that the justice system's main goal should be finding the truth and holding criminals accountable. This created a major conflict between two important ideas. On one side, the government has the responsibility to investigate crimes and also protect society, but on the other side, individuals have constitutional rights that protect them from government overreach. This conflict is literally one of the biggest themes in criminal law. Criminal justice is not only about asking whether someone committed a crime, it's also about asking whether the government followed the rules while trying to prove that that crime happened. The Supreme Court now had to decide which principle should take priority. Should illegally obtained evidence still be allowed if it helps convict someone? Or should protecting constitutional rights be more important, even if it means some evidence cannot be used? In 1961, the Supreme Court had finally made its decision. The court ruled in favor of Dole v. Mapp. The decision was 6-3. The justices held that the exclusionary rule applies to state governments, not just the federal government. This meant that evidence obtained through an illegal search violating the Fourth Amendment could not be used in state criminal trials. This was a huge change. Before this decision, states had different rules about illegally obtained evidence. After this decision, every single state had to follow the same constitutional standard. The Fourth Amendment was no longer just an idea written on paper. It had a real consequence. If police violated someone's constitutional protection against unreasonable searches, the evidence they found could be excluded from court. And that single-handedly changed the way law enforcement worked across the country. The decision in Mapp v. Ohio completely changed the relationship between law enforcement and constitutional rights. The Supreme Court was not saying that police cannot investigate crimes. They were not saying that evidence found by police is automatically unreliable. And they were not saying that people accused of crimes should avoid consequences. Instead, the court was creating a limit on how the government can collect evidence. The message behind the decision was simple. The government has the power to investigate a crime, but that power has boundaries. Police officers still have an important job. They need to collect evidence, solve crimes, and protect communities. But the Constitution requires that they do those things while respecting people's rights. This was one of the biggest ideas in criminal law. The government's responsibility to enforce the law has to be balanced with protecting individual freedoms. After Mapp v. Ohio, police departments across the country had to become much more careful about how they conducted searches. Officers now had stronger reason to make sure they followed the proper legal process. They needed to make sure they had valid warrants. They needed to make sure searches stayed within the limits of what was legally allowed. And they needed to understand that if they ignored constitutional protections, the evidence they collected could disappear from a trial. This created what many people call a deterrent effect. Basically, the rule was designed to discourage illegal searches by creating consequences when officers do not follow the Constitution. Without the exclusionary rule, some could argue, even if police break the rules, they still get to use whatever they find. The Supreme Court believed that would weaken the Fourth Amendment because there would be little reason for law enforcement to respect a right that had no real enforcement. However, it is also important to understand that the exclusionary rule does not apply in every single situation. What I've learned from reading and learning about these cases is that criminal law is rarely completely simple. Over time, courts have created exceptions to the rule. For example, if police can prove that they would have found the evidence legally anyway, the evidence may still be allowed in court. This is known as the invitable discovery exception. Another exception involves situations where officers act in good faith. For example, if officers believe that they are following a valid warrant, but there is later found to be a legal problem with that warrant, courts may consider whether the officers were genuinely trying to follow the law. These exceptions exist because courts are constantly trying to balance two goals: protecting constitutional rights while also allowing the justice system to function. This balance is one of the reasons criminal law is so complicated. There is almost always a conflict between different important values. In Mapp v. Ohio, the conflict was between protecting privacy and protecting the ability of police to use evidence in criminal cases. The Supreme Court decided that constitutional rights had to come first. But the impact of this case goes beyond just police searches. Mapp v. Ohio changed the way Americans think about Constitution. It shows that constitutional rights are not just words written in a document, they are protections that actually affect what the government is allowed to do. The case also connects to a bigger idea in the American legal system called due process. Due process means that the government must follow fair procedures when taking actions against someone. It is not enough for the government to believe someone is guilty. The government has to prove guilt while following the rules. This idea appears throughout criminal law. For example, in our last case, episode 1 in Miranda v. Arizona, the Supreme Court focused on protecting people during police questioning. In Mapp v. Ohio, the court focused on protecting people during searches. Both cases asked a similar question: how do we make sure the government has enough power to enforce laws while still protecting individual rights? And that question continues to shape criminal law today. When you think about police searches now, many of the rules people consider normal exist because of the case like Mapp v. Ohio. The idea that police generally need a warrant before searching a home, the idea that illegally collected evidence may not be used in court, and the idea that constitutional protections need actual consequences behind them, all of these concepts just connects back to this case. But there is also another interesting part of Mapp v. Ohio. The outcome did not mean Dolly Mapp was proven innocent. The Supreme Court did not decide whether the materials found in her home were legal or illegal. The court focused on the way the police obtained the evidence. The issue was not simply what the police found, the issue was how they found it. And that distinction is extremely important in criminal law. A person can be accused of a crime, but the government still has to follow constitutional rules while investigating and building its case. The justice system is not only about reaching a result, it's about reaching a result fairly. And that is what makes Mapp v. Ohio such an important case as well. It changed the rules of criminal investigations by making it clear that protecting constitutional rights is not optional. The government cannot ignore someone's rights just because it believes that person may have committed a crime. The process matters, and the Constitution matters. Now that we've really discovered why this case matters in today's world, a lot of you may be asking, well, what happened to Dolly Mapp? What happened to her? Even though the Supreme Court ruled her in favor, does that mean she didn't get arrested? Did that mean she wasn't convicted? Well, after the Supreme Court ruled in her favor, Dolly Mapp's conviction was overturned, meaning her original conviction was no longer valid. The evidence used against her cannot be used because it was obtained through an unconstitutional search. However, the Supreme Court did not declare her innocent or hold a new trial deciding whether she actually committed the crime. The main focus of this case was whether the evidence should have been even allowed in court. After the case, Mapp continued living her life outside of the spotlight. Her case became remembered not as of the final outcome for her personally, but because it changed the rules of criminal investigations across the entire United States. This case has taught us so much about police investigations and about the Fourth Amendment, constitutional searches, even the Supreme Court. And I think this case was super interesting and a great way to develop more knowledge on rights and on law in general, specifically criminal law. Tune in for our next case, and thank you for listening.